find ways to put some pressure on them to step up and relieve American taxpayers who I thought were being disproportionately burdened. In this campaign, you know, President Obama nominated Sonia Sotomayor to the Supreme Court, and a lot of Republicans reflexively said, oh, we're against her. And I'm the guy that said, wait a minute, you know, it's not reasonable for us to expect a Democratic president to pick someone off our list. Now, Judge Sotomayor wouldn't have been on my list. But the question isn't whether she agrees with me politically. The question is she qualified for this job? And so I did a lot of research on her record and discovered that despite some unfortunate comments she made, she was a very capable person, very intelligent. Her decisions were entirely within the judicial mainstream. And she clearly had no bias. She administered justice impartially, as best I could determine from looking at a lot of her cases. So I came out and publicly said that Republicans should vote to confirm her. I took some heat from some of my friends on that, but I think that's an example of where the partisanship is carried too far, and I would try to you know, prevent that from happening.
I have a couple of questions. First, do you believe your campaign ads talk more about your opponent than yourself? And second question is on Social Security. Can you elaborate on
Sure.
your position on privatizing Social Security?
Well, I wouldn't characterize it as privatizing Social Security, but I will explain exactly what I have in mind there. You know, the very first campaign ad that I ran after the primary was over was an ad that put up the pictures, I think it was the pictures from our service in Congress, me and Joe Sestak, and it said, two good men with different views, and then went through a list of issues on which we disagree. That was the tone and the substance of this. If you look at my ads, it's all been about what is the contrast between our two approaches to getting this economy moving and restoring fiscal discipline in Washington. Unfortunately, Joe Sestak hasn't said a single word that I'm aware of in all of the millions of dollars that he has spent on ads, defending any of his record or talking about any of the things he's going to do. It's been a series of really pretty outrageous and often dishonest charges about me, including, you know, complete distortions of my background. So I think that's unfortunate because we really disagree about a lot of substantive policy, and that's what the people of Pennsylvania ought to hear about. You know, how should we go forward on health care? What should tax policy be? What should the government spend? These are the important things. On Social Security, here's what I've said all along. First of all, anybody who's already retired or close to retirement has to get all the benefits they were promised with no exceptions. Anything else would be outrageous and unfair. And when I was a member of the House, I sponsored legislation that would have made it out of order for Congress to even consider a bill that would cut anybody's benefits who was already receiving benefits. Now, that being said, anybody who's looked at this honestly has to acknowledge that the system in its current design isn't going to last forever. The demographic reality is such that we're going to have to make some changes. I think we should have a vigorous, constructive discussion about what those changes are. And there's lots of different ideas out there. I've put one on the table, and my opponent has not, but I have. What I've said is, let's give young workers a choice. Within a reformed Social Security program, let's give those who want to participate in the current program as is, that's fine, they can do that. But those who'd like to, I would suggest we give them a choice of taking a portion of the payroll taxes that they would otherwise pay and allow them to accumulate savings. And over the course of the 45 years, plus or minus, that the average person works, accumulated savings can add up very, very substantially, even for a worker of modest income. And that accumulated savings could become the basis for a portion of their retirement benefit. So, you know, I think it needs to be properly diversified, professionally managed, and the accounts ought to, over time, as a person approaches retirement age, shift to ever less volatile instruments and capital preservation like savings and CDs and treasuries. But those are the sort of details that would be worked out. If we're going to make progress on these big entitlement programs, it needs to be bipartisan, but people need to step up and offer ideas, and that's what I've tried to do.
But do you expect somebody who makes that choice and takes a different risk will get a different reward, or different reimbursement than others?
Well, yeah, I think people who do that are probably going to end up doing much better than people who don't. If you look at a young person today and you crunch through the numbers and you look at what Social Security in its current form is promising that worker, it's a return of anywhere from -1 to 1% on all the money that the person puts in. Now, over a 45-year period, a combination of investments in America, which is really what this is, a diversified set of investments, has never done anywhere near that badly. So I think in all likelihood, a lot of people would select this option and they'll do better.
That's looking at it over the long period.
Right.
In a shorter window, when the market's bad and you're about to retire, and
Right. Right. This
what
is
happens to those people
exactly.
that took the risk? What do we do for them?
This is why I have always stressed that as you approach retirement age, the assets would need to be shifted away from more volatile instruments like stocks and into capital preservation instruments like CDs and cash and treasuries. And if you do that, now this is of course a well-known investment practice. It's done in every college 529 program. Are you familiar with those? It's a tax-spared program that allows you, a parent or a family member, to invest some savings to pay for a kid's college. And it works exactly the same way. If the kid is 1 year old, it's mostly stocks because historically stocks have generated a better return. By the time the child is 16, it's mostly CDs and treasuries because you're about to need to use the money, and so you can't take the risk of the volatility. That natural sort of common sense evolution in the composition of the portfolio, I think, would apply in this case as well.
People in the country have this feeling that they've set aside the money as they through their working life and it's going to be there for them. And the reality is,
and as you know, the money was never set. It was never designed as a savings plan.
Right.
The money was never saved. It was never invested. It's always been a pay-as-you-go system. And that worked fine in the days when we had 16 workers paying for every retiree, but today we have about 3 and we're on our way to 2. And that's why we've got to make some changes. And I think a system based on personal savings is one idea we ought to take a hard look at.
Questions from over here?
Have you heard from anyone else any other ideas for Social Security that you would be interested in either combining with your idea, or I mean, I haven't heard anything else other than privatizing or keeping it the way it is. Is there anything else?
Well, there are other ideas that have been put on the table. They generally have some big drawbacks, most of them. One of the common ones is just push back the retirement age. Right? So if you push back the retirement age enough, you can solve the government's financing problem. It's a way of cutting benefits. You know, seriously. I mean, some have proposed that. Now, here's my problem with that. I have a lot of problems, but one is, if you are an architect, right, and you're perfectly healthy, and you love your work, then if someone says, well, guess what, you can't really retire until you're 70. Well, maybe that's okay for the architect. But what about my dad? My dad crawled into a hole, underground manhole, and pulled cable through a conduit and had to, connect wires. It was heavy manual labor outside every day. To ask a guy like that to keep working in that environment until he's 70, we all live longer, but we still age. So I don't think just pushing back the retirement age is that good a solution. The other proposal that's often put on the table is, well, let's raise taxes. Well, there's a price to that too. Obviously, an impact on the people whose taxes you raise, but generally, you really run the risk of slower economic growth. The higher you raise taxes, the lower economic growth is likely to be. So there are other ideas out there. They've got drawbacks. In the end, I'm probably not going to be able to write the bill exactly the way I'd want it. But as I say, I think people ought to be putting ideas on the table so that we can find a solution.
Pennsylvania is considered one of the worst states for doctors to practice.
Mm-hmm.
Because no cap on lawsuits. What is your solution, or what do you intend to do about it?
Well, I think that's true, and we have a big problem with shortage of doctors. We train a tremendous number of doctors in some of the best universities and medical schools in the world, and then they go somewhere else. And the thing that's one of the most heartbreaking conversations that I've had, and I've had it too many times in this campaign, is older doctors who tell me that they're encouraging their kids not to go into medicine. That is just tragic. So I do think we need tort reform. I think that needs to be part of comprehensive, healthcare reform, because there's big costs that are embedded in the system. It's not just the direct costs of litigation and malpractice insurance, but I think it's also the practice of defensive medicine. And when other states do this and we don't, the other states become a more attractive place to practice medicine. So we've got a bigger problem.
But why is it there at the state level? Why it's not considered a national issue? Why not at a national level?
Ideally, I think it would be done at the state level. That would be my preference. But we clearly haven't been able to get there, and it is a big national problem. So I would support national legislation to do it. I have supported it in the past.
The Bush-era tax cuts are about to expire. What would you propose there?
I would propose we make them all permanent with two exceptions. Exception number one is I think we should actually lower the capital gains rate rather than keep it where it is today. There's a very, well, I'm a guy that started small businesses. My restaurant business, I started from scratch with my brothers. So I understand very well how entrepreneurs respond to incentives, because I've been one. If we lower the capital gains rate, we increase the return on risk. And that's going to encourage more people to take risk. More investment, more startups, more small business growth, more economic growth. Alan Sinai had a great column. He's a very well-respected economist, and he has demonstrated a pretty strong correlation between stronger economic growth and lower capital gains rate. So it's not just my theory. I think that would be very constructive. The second exception to making them all permanent is I would take the top corporate tax rate of 35% and lower it to 25%. We have the second highest top marginal business tax rate in the entire industrial world, behind only Japan, and Japan's in the process of lowering theirs most likely. And so that puts us at a competitive disadvantage, and it creates an incentive for multinational companies especially to headquarters somewhere else so that they'll pay less in taxes. They've got an obligation to their shareholders. And so when the majority of our trading partners, actually virtually all of our competitors, have lower rates than we do, we're asking for trouble. We're asking to lose jobs. So I would recommend that we lower ours to 25%.
How would you afford to be able to do that?
I think that the extra economic growth and the inducement to be located here would more than offset the lower marginal rate. And that's an important fundamental idea that I think we should not lose sight of. Growing the economic base on which you apply the rates is the most important thing to do. And I think we would do that by lowering that rate.
For the rookies in the small business, the restaurant in Allentown, you were investing in New York, and your opponent paints that as a relationship between what's happened in the markets and your background. What do you see?
Well, it's a very disingenuous charge on his part, and really, it's very unfortunate that he can't defend his own record and he has to bring up this nonsense. When I worked in finance, which I did from 1984 till about 1990, I left finance 20 years ago. And while I was there, I was doing interest rate and currency swaps. These are a risk management tool, and it helps borrowers and people who have exposure to interest rate changes in interest rates and changes in currency